Afternoon, everybody. This is one of the fortnightly brief bite seminars run by the IOSH Environment and Waste Management Group. This time we are in conjunction with the construction group, and I'd like to welcome everybody for registering and joining. We are actually live on YouTube for the first time. We've had over 1,400 registrants, which is fantastic. And I hope it's that people are genuinely interested and haven't got quite lunchtime. Today's speaker, Professor Hare from Glasgow, Caledonian University. Billy, if I wrote down a biography, it'd be far too long and take up the next half an hour. But in short, Billy started his life on the tools, on the roofs, and progressed through degrees and academia and publishing. He's published in construction management in terms of waste management, in terms of ill health of people working in the waste sector. And his most recent piece of work actually has been being an expert witness or expert contributor for the infection control incidents that happened at Queen Elizabeth University Hospital a number of years ago. So Billy is working across sectors. We're extremely lucky to have him. He's always delighted to come, always interesting to hear. So from this point, I hand over to Billy. And at the end of the session, I will try and take questions. But the key thing is, please don't post any questions up until at least 30 minutes into the presentation. And there are a lot of you there, so I might not be able to get through every single question of the time we've got. What we'll try and do, we will save the questions that have been typed in, and there's always a chance of doing a written question and answer afterwards. But I will try and filter the questions out before I put them to Billy, because if we all put in a question, we won't get round to them. So from that point, Billy, less of me and more of you, and all the best.
Thank you, David, and thank you for that introduction. As David has mentioned, I'm an academic from Glasgow Caledonian University, and I want to speak to you today regarding research that I did just before the pandemic-induced lockdown. It completed just around about January, February this year, and it relates to, if I just share my screen and bring up the PowerPoint presentation for you. It relates to something around construction waste, and it was researched to try and do an update study of the true cost of materials wastage in construction projects. Now, some of you on the call today may know me from my more substantive research area, which David alluded to there, which is on the management of health and safety risks, which I'll say a little more about in a moment. But for today, and this is just another area of interest to me, which has been for a number of years, but I don't get the time to do as much research and other work in this area, is the reduction of construction materials wastage on construction projects. So as David says, I work as an academic at Glasgow Caledonian University. I'm Deputy Director of what's called the Broom Research Centre. That stands for Built Environment and Asset Management Research Centre. And that's within the School of Computing, Engineering and Built Environment. Now, the webinar today is billed as, I think, something along the lines of improving your waste management on construction projects. But just to be clear, what I want to report today is on this project regarding how we went about identifying the true cost of construction waste. But along the way, I've applied a little bit of my health and safety insights. And the phrase that I like to use is identifying the root cause of the waste rather than just managing the waste as it arrives in the skip. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. I should manage your expectations, however. It's not entirely root cause analysis as we might see it within the accident causation area. In terms of managing your expectations, I've probably barely scratched the surface here, but you'll see how we go along the slides, what I've done, and hopefully you'll find it useful and interesting. I'm sure you will, but then again, I have something of a biased view on this. The work that we did was funded by a government organisation known as Zero Waste Scotland, and I thank them for their funding of the research, and they're acknowledged as well. So before I get into the detail of that, I'd just like to do a little bit of the corporate blurb for my institution that employs me. The Glasgow Caledonian University, or GCU for short, has the tagline, our ethos is University for the Common Good. And we pride ourselves on our ability to engage with research and other work for the common good of our neighbours and our global neighbours as well. And our research centre, the Broom Research Centre, has 3 areas of discipline that we undertake our work around, and that is sustainable cities and communities, construction project risk and value management is where my discipline sits, and building resilience and environmental impact, which crosses over with the subject matter that we're discussing today on the impact of waste. Just a little mention of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These have become quite popular in recent years. At GCU, we adopted these as our guiding principles for quite a number of years. We have been one of the first organisations to adopt it, or first academic organisations at least. And we're almost drilled in. Which SDG do you and your research talk to? So I can tell you off the top of my head immediately that sustainable goal number 3, good health and well-being, which is the health side of health and safety, and goal number 8, decent work and economic growth. Decent work includes safe work, so there you go. Number 8 and number 3, that's our health and safety. But as I said, today, I'm not saying too much about that work. We're looking at what might be termed under goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. Now, I was asked if I could include some quick questions for some polls to keep it interactive as we go. So this is the first of such, and in the background, our IOSH team will, I think, put a poll up, and there you go, there's the poll. And I'd like you to choose, just so I can have an idea of who's on the call, who the audience are. Are you particularly health and or safety in terms of your job role? Does your job role include environment in that? Or is it health, safety and something else, maybe quality or business improvement, or none of the above, and you do something quite different? So if you do that, then I think what will happen is the details will be collated and we will see the results of that within a minute or two. Okay. So I'll leave that running. It might come up now or it might come up near the end of the talk, but if and when it comes up, we can revisit it and see what the result is. I'd like to just say a little bit, because I am known more for my IOSH research, just want to do another little plug for that. So the area of CDM in the UK, that's the Construction Design and Management Regulations, and within that the Design Risk Management area is somewhere that I do a considerable amount of work, and I've written guidance as well for the CITB, the Construction Industry Training Board, and the Institution of Civil Engineers and the Chartered Institute of Building. And my most recent work, funded by the IOSH Research and Development Programme, developed based on the HSE Red, Amber, Green, or RAG list, examples for designers, mainly architects, and we developed a visual pictograph database for that to help and educate designers. I shouldn't use the word educate, but help enhance their ability to identify hazards in their designs. So I thought it would be worth giving that a little plug along with the link there for you. Just as before I move on, I can see that the question 1 results have come in, and over 68% of you are health, safety and environment. So that's a good sign. It tells me that the majority of the audience is interested in the environment element of today's talk. Thank you. Other areas which I've been involved in as well in terms of my research, work at height, technical aspects of that. The IOSH practitioner, which I have to tell you was the very first published piece of research from the IOSH Research and Development Fund, and you can find that on the IOSH website. And one of the findings from that, incidentally, showed that high-performing construction companies had OSH practitioners with a health, safety, and environment job description. So that's quite relevant to today and of some use to you as well. Other areas I've been involved in is worker engagement, which is a term well used within HSE construction division, and work flowing from that has also resulted in a little app for identifying your worker engagement maturity. It's a bit clunky, I would say, just again to manage your expectations, but it was a work in progress funded by Berkeley Group, the London-based property developer, and it's quite useful in terms of the individual workers' worker engagement maturity, but it does need a little bit of an update, and if you're interested in that, you can speak to me offline later. So let's ask another quick question, and here it is. We're going to be talking about the true cost of waste in typically an 8-yard mixed skip, and there's a very often quoted figure for what that costs the average contractor in construction. So I'm asking you to guess what you think it is. Is it 300, 1,300, 2,300 or £3,000? Just to gauge if anyone is on the ball here and knows the figure that's often quoted. I'll give you a second to answer that because the next slide gives you the answer to this question, so I wouldn't want any cheating going on. That's the lecturer in me jumping out. So giving you another minute or two, it's going to be one of these 4 answers, and hopefully you've submitted your answer by now because I'm now going to show you the answer. And the answer is the 1,300 figure, just there or thereabouts, about £1,300 is the often quoted figure of the true cost of the materials that are placed in a construction skip. And the results of there say that 42% of you got that correct. So not too bad, that's reasonable, a reasonable number of you who have either guessed or you indeed know the correct answer. This figure is, however, a little out of date, and this was the reason for the Zero Waste Scotland project, was to ask, has that figure changed? I mean, the date is significant, isn't it? It's just prior to the 2008 global recession, and we've had some various things happen in between as well. So we were asked, you know, is it still the case? Is it still 65% the purchase value of the waste, what you as a contractor have paid for that waste, the skip hire cost being 12%, the labour cost to put the waste in the skip, and the VAT at 20%. Although when this work was done in 2007, I'm sure the VAT level was 15 or 17.5%. So there's been some variation in the VAT figure as well. So some waste tools that I came across doing this research that I thought would bring up, just for your information if you're not already aware of them. The BRE Smart Waste Tool is probably the most well known, and there's a link to it. What I find though with it is that it's very much, if you talk in health and safety terms, it's looking at the scene of the accident and doesn't do too much, in my opinion, to backtrack through the accident causation or the incident of waste going in the skip. The causation model doesn't feature too much in it. I may be wrong because, you know, I've not seen more recent versions of it, which you have to subscribe to see it. So it may have been updated since I last looked at it. RAP also have the net waste tool, although when I looked at it recently, I couldn't find the tool. I'm not sure if it still exists in that format, but there's plenty of guidance on that as well. And RAP also, in conjunction with RIBA, have produced not so much a tool, but working method for designers to try and design out waste from the start using techniques such as the one that's on the screen there. Like is it low impact? Is it low difficulty? Then that's an easy one to implement. If it's high impact but difficult to implement, it might be more or less achievable. So tools like that and others are in that guide, and the links are there for your information. But and my take on this is that they've not really looked at a bit like site waste management plans. They look at the waste as it arises, but to what extent do they go beyond that, the reasons why the waste is produced? And that's where I've got the title there, Find the Root Cause of the Waste. We wanted to also update that figure of £1,300, which incidentally was based on one site, one skip in 2007. So it's not exactly a large database, a large sample to take it from. We have, in fact, undertaken the work that I'm going to show you today is a pilot study, but it was using 3 sites. So that's already 3 times the sample size of the original work that was done. And the other thing I want to show you is the methods that were used as well. So what I've got here is just a summary of those root cause factors that might result in waste being in the skip. So you might have design and client influence. I won't go through every one of them, but things like buildability issues or the client changing their minds. And it wouldn't be the first time when I worked on construction sites where we had to pull down a blockwork wall because the client changed their mind what position it would be in. So unless you find out the source of that, then how can you improve matters? We then got to things like delivery or procurement issues, such as possibly over-ordering. And from a site-based background, it's always better to have too much than too little, but that's another factor that can result in waste in the skip, as well as transportation issues and other issues around packaging, for example. Then that's eventually at this point you get to the site management practices, such as poor storage and transportation within the site that might result in breakages, damages, or losses. So these are all things that are important as to trying to track down the source, why your waste is in the skip. The work that we did, I employed a researcher. The funding played for a researcher that had quite a boring existence on the site at the skip, logging all the information, and they had a tablet. We purchased a tablet. We used a very simple spreadsheet, but it had drop-down lists for various options, which I'll come to in a moment. And the researcher was permanently on the site for sites 1 and 3 because the skips in those sites filled up quite quickly. So these are an 8-yard mixed waste skip. On site 2, it took far longer time, which will become evident when we look at the data, to fill the skip. Therefore, that was intermittent visits from the researcher. Of course, we had to consider risk assessment and safety issues, so the researcher had site inductions. I specifically asked that we did not have sites that incorporated a chute system for fear of being struck from items from above. We did accept sites that were using forklifts to load the skip because we did have an experienced researcher who'd worked on construction sites. On one of the sites, we also used a GoPro camera to test how useful a camera could be to collect this data rather than just someone standing at the skip on a permanent basis. The data we collected now, the spreadsheet you can see there is just for illustration purposes, but this was the data that we collected. Some basic stuff there. We had a drop-down list for the type of waste, and that included the waste code for the type of waste, a description because the waste could be timber, but you wouldn't know exactly what that waste might be. So there was a cell for description of what the waste is. And then this all-important source of the waste, and the way we got this information was just speaking to the workers, then backtracking through the management teams to identify exactly why the waste has ended up in the skip, the distance that they've travelled, because that's important for calculating the costs, the labour costs for putting the waste in the skip. If there was repeat items, then how many? Then we either took the dimensions using a visual, and the researcher had a measuring tape if needed, but it was mostly using visual estimations, and you either put in the dimensions or the volume of what was in the skip. We also decided to include the condition. We had, again, a drop-down list with definitions of what was, we had such as good as new or right down to useless, put it in landfill. And here's just some examples of those drop-down lists that I thought you might find interesting. So that's typical of the construction waste definitions: insulation, concrete, bricks, along with their code, which comes up automatically when you choose that option in the drop-down. the all-important source, so things like cutting waste, damage, learning waste if it's a new product. These are all things here. But as I say, I want to manage your expectations. Very few of these were identified, and it was basically a kind of low-level assessment of why the waste has arisen. But even that is refreshing compared to what would normally happen, which would be identifying which subcontractor produced the waste and just bashing the subcontractor until they had less waste. And the last one there, that was that condition, and there was definitions of what as good as new meant, what reusable meant, slightly damaged, or put it to landfill, for example. In terms of the cost calculations, we got costs in some occasions from the contractor, what they had purchased the materials for. If we didn't have that, we would go to a typical price book, such as Spons, or the last option was maybe builders merchants cost information there. And in one of the sites, we had zero VAT because it was a house building site, which I'll come to more information in a moment. To calculate the costs, the labour costs, we had the hourly rates, the average time. We researched how long it would take to carry the waste to the skip, which we calculated to be on average 3 kilometres per hour, 2 kilometres in a hoist, and 8 kilometres in a forklift. That equates to roughly 5 miles an hour, which is the typical forklift speed limit on a site. We also identified what it might cost to fix problems. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but when things go wrong and the reason the waste is in the skip might be that it was installed incorrectly or it was damaged, then there was a cost allocated to fixing that problem. And yet we also had, in some occasions, wrongly specified materials that were chucked in the skip, and that has got cost implications as well. Other things that we identified but were negligible was the power for the hoist and the fuel for the forklift. We did not include the higher costs for hoist and forklift because we decided you need that equipment whether you're producing the waste or not. The 3 sites were basically a commercial building site, a refurbishment, a civil engineering site, and a new build housing on Greenbelt. So these were specifically chosen from the various options we had, so we had a good mix of different types of site. And site 1 included the use of the GoPro camera. We also approached some site waste management contractors because we thought we could possibly tip one of the skips out at the waste transfer station and collect the data that way. That might have been a more cost-effective way, but we ended up, after 3 attempts at 3 different waste contractors, we gave up because they were too interested in productivity and could not, even with a £1,000 incentive, they would not give us enough time to analyse the waste as it came from the site into the waste transfer station. So that tells you a little bit about the priorities of our waste management sector here in Scotland. So let's have a look at the results then. Site 1 was a city centre refurbishment. There's some information on that. There was a soft strip already undertaken, but there were still elements still being stripped out as the new plasterboard and fixings and partitions were being installed. 7 floors, 4 operatives with 240-litre wheelie bins using the hoist to transport waste down to the skip. On the slide there is, this was a draft drawing by the researcher identifying where a typical floor slab and the route taken to the skip, which is on the left-hand side. The GoPro camera was on the scaffold across from the skip, and that's the picture of the skip there, which has been analysed. And this was filled within half a day, so a very fast-moving site, which gave us data really quickly. The waste was calculated in terms of volumes. So as you might guess, that based on the type of work that was being done, the greatest amount of waste came from offcuts of plasterboard. The demolition waste was mostly other types of plasterboard and timber. Timber as well created for 14% of the waste in metals, 10%. When we put the purchase cost against that using our method, then it was £343 worth of plasterboard that was offcut. Timber, 519, and metals, 43. So total purchase cost of £905. When you add on the other costs, the labour costs and the skip hire, there was a permit cost as well. That came out at £1,351 approximately, and that was almost bang on the current figure of £1,300. Then you start to look at the waste source. So when we look at, so what is the waste source? So the cutting waste was accountable for 63% of that waste in the skip. Mostly the plasterboard, but also some of the timber and the metals were down to cutting waste. When looking at possible solutions to that, we said to the contractor, you might want to consider things like digital scanning and the use of digital technologies and even prefabrication. I can appreciate for when there's an existing building, that's difficult to do, but the digital scanning these days can allow you to have more accurate assessments of dimensions, and standardization of dimensions is key to trying to reduce the amount of cutting waste. So that's just one example of how we assisted with that particular site. The waste condition, what we found was that most of the waste was suitable for recycling. Now, we don't know what happened to the skip once it goes to the waste contractor's transfer station, so possibly it was recycled, but with a mixed waste skip, we are unsure. You don't know really what's happening with that waste. And we identified that 15%, which was basically mostly contaminated or unsuitable for recycling, was in that skip. So large scope for recycling in that particular skip. So, like I said earlier, use of the words like timber doesn't really give you a good indication of what is in the skip. What you can see here is cable drums that were chucked in the skip, and they are an example of packaging, if you want to call it that could have been reused rather than recycled. So there was opportunities there to recycle. That's just a comparison of the camera data versus the on-site data. The camera was basically, we trialed, if you watch the camera after the event, is the camera picking up the same data that the operative on-site is picking up? So is the camera any use? The table that I'm showing you there shows the site data in the first column. The middle column is the camera data. When I say camera, that's basically another researcher who's not on the site using the camera footage to try and ascertain the same volumes of waste. And you can see that in many cases they were 35 or 45% differential between the two, which shows that the camera is quite until we introduce some level of artificial intelligence, the camera as an option did not really seem to be a viable alternative. So you really need someone there on the site. If I move to site 2, this was a civil engineering site, a very large site, mostly groundworks going on, and not much call for mixed waste going into the mixed waste skip. There was a forklift in operation. We also had a dedicated supervisor at the waste compound, and there was 4 segregation skips. So as it turned out, the main amount of waste going into this skip for the civil engineering contractor was actually from the welfare units, which I'll explain in a moment. The layout of the site here can be seen, the site offices in red and the skip compound in yellow, and then the red circle showing all the areas where the waste was coming from, but the vast majority of the waste was coming from the site welfare facility. And as you can see from the photograph I've just brought up, that's basically the majority of the waste in the skip was from the plastic bags coming from the, so although it was mixed waste, it was mostly from the welfare facility. And that's reflected in the pie chart there. The welfare waste was 91%. There was other stuff such as expanding foam, something I've called office waste. That included a laptop bag and drawings that were discarded in the skip, and an element of packaging, but some of that packaging was the type that could be reused, although it was put in the skip anyway. The welfare waste we decided was not a project cost, so things like empty cans and crisp packets and such like was not purchased by the contractor, so we didn't consider it a project waste. The office waste we did, and we had put prices on that, and the expanding foam and some of the packaging that could have been reused was included there. So a rather smaller figure in terms of materials cost of £331. What I will say also is that the supervisor saved in the region of about £240 worth of waste going to the mixed skip by removing it from the mixed waste skip and putting it into the segregated skips. So this was mostly timber, plastic and packaging. That's just some photos of that, the actual supervisor in amongst the skip taking out things that could go into the other skips. So things like the plastic ducting in the top left-hand corner, although it was in the skip there at the photograph, it was not in the skip by the end of the day. So we decided that for the purposes of our project, it's not in the skip at the end of the day, so we did not count it as wastage because it was in some way going in the other recycling skip and it would be in some way recycled. In terms of the overall costs there, once we take the materials purchase cost and add our other items on, it came up to a rather low figure of 761. There's a new item introduced here, which was labour, including fixing errors, which I'll come to in just a moment. So by doing the source analysis, we find that some of the waste is in there due to a fixing problem. So the poor segregation of welfare waste is a 91%. The cutting waste was from cables, offcuts from cables, so the same issue of offcuts. And the poor fixing quality came from expanding foam. So that expanding foam was used to plug gaps in shuttering. So shuttering had been damaged and the groundwork contractors had used the expanding foam to plug those gaps, and then it ends up in the skip. So you could look at that different ways. It could be seen as a necessary of waste from the temporary works. But if the method of the formwork had been better, or the quality of the formwork shuttering had been better, then you would not have needed that expanding foam. So it identifies a potential issue there that could be resolved for future concreting works. There's a very small amount of packaging here down to the supervisor moving that out of the mixed waste skip and into the designated segregation skip. So going back to that issue of the welfare waste, so the welfare units did have recycling bins, as you can see in the left-hand picture, but the right-hand photo showed that the workers themselves were not adhering to this, and lots of wrong waste in the bins that was not adequate, and they ended up in the mixed waste skip. So missed opportunity there to recycle plastic and metal cans. So in terms of possible solutions there, things we've seen from other contractors is bring your own bottles to work, or actually installing a facility on site for cans and bottles, plastic cans and metal cans as well as plastic bottles. So that was something that we identified for that particular site. The condition of the waste, we introduced a new condition classification, mostly recyclable. So what we were saying there, about 70% of the contents of the plastic bags from the welfare waste was recyclable, either through cans or bottles. And we did a quick calculation on what you would get in terms of money for those, for the amount of plastic and metal cans and bottles, and it was worked out to be in the region of about £57. Not a great amount, but I think the bigger issue here is 90% of the mixed waste skip, we're paying, or the contractor's paying for this skip to be on the site, and that cost is really going to 90%, over 90% for that welfare waste that could be avoided. Therefore, either the skip could be used for a longer period of time, or could maybe even not be required at all. Now, I'm keen to get to site 3 because this is the one where the actual source analysis was extremely useful. This was probably the most useful because of the amount of waste. I don't want that to be a commentary, maybe how wasteful house builders are, but from this house builder, we got a lot of waste. There was unfortunately not an 8-yard waste mixed waste skip on site. They used 40-yard skips, which were fed by small hopper skips from the plots, the various housing plots. So we calculated how many hopper skips would equate to an 8-yard skip, was somewhere in the region of, I think it was 7 or 8 hopper skips, and we therefore analysed the data from 8 hopper skips. The site skip compound is in yellow on the image there on the slide, and the site offices to the left, and the red rectangles where the waste was coming from various plots, and these were at different levels, from timber kits being installed to fitting out to almost completed plots. And that's just an image there of the hopper skips that we got our data from. So in terms of the actual waste there, about 30% insulation waste. This was Kingspan solid insulation in the region of about £547 of purchase cost to the contractor or the house builder, so to speak. Timber in the region of £226. Plastic, typical plastic for domestic house dwellings of £200, and metal to the value of about £120. Others, and there was lots of other individual things, too many to put in the pie chart, of extreme obscure items in the skips that we'll come to in a moment. So a total here, the greatest cost was to the house builder, £1,200 worth of purchase cost of materials in the skip. Once we add on our damage and errors, which is a substantial amount, which I'll come to in a moment, the true cost to Site 3 was in the region of nearly £2,500. When we look at the source, the reason for this waste being in the skip, we've got cutting waste again, timber, metal, plastic, and insulation. But there was quite a number of damaged items. Again, the insulation, the majority of the insulation was in the skip because it had been damaged. Metal barriers had been damaged, and even a broomstick that had been damaged. Now, I know ban the broom is a phrase that's used a lot in construction these days, but that's taking it too far, I think. Wrongly specified items as well. These included door stops, packers, plastic packers, and latex gloves, which I assume were deemed not suitable for the workforce. So these are things that are being chucked in the skip unused because they've been wrongly specified. We also had temporary fencing. Now, you could call this temporary works, you could call it prelims. Fencing that house builders tend to put up to look pretty, but also fence off phases of the work and essentially serve no purpose after the work is done and end up in the skip, which I thought was rather wasteful as well. There was some over-ordering, which I've not got, small amount that's too small to put on the pie chart as well. These lost opportunities to prevent the waste. So there's an example of the Kingspan that's been chucked in the skip because it's been damaged. In the background of that image are the fence panels or the barriers, metal and plastic barriers damaged by vehicles, probably the forklift. And then this is the fencing that was perfectly good order, but then is no longer required and chucked in the skip, the mixed skip, even though there was a timber skip available as well. So in terms of possible solutions here, there's an image of the storage area, which looks fine for the Kingspan insulation, but obviously something's happening there between the storage and the installation, where it's been left out, it's been damaged during the transportation. That's boxes of the latex gloves, unused, put in the skip. And here's the packers that were then unused as well. I don't have a picture of the door stops, but when I worked on site, if I saw something like a box of door stops, I think they were brass or metal anyway, high quality, they went in the skip. I would have probably took those home just because I couldn't face something like that going in the skip. Also the issue of temporary fencing and structures that end up in the skip. I've learnt a lot from the sporting and entertainment industry in terms of temporary demountable structures, which can be grounded down so they don't blow over in the wind, and they're sturdy enough, and they can be reused time after time. I don't know why house builders don't investigate that as an option. So lots of opportunities there for improvement. The waste condition, in terms of stuff going to landfill, is because it was mostly contaminated, because it had been damaged or contaminated. Wrongly specified was as good as new, so that could have been used elsewhere. And there was other small items like debris netting, roofing felt, concrete blocks as well that were completely reusable but went in the skip as well, and suitable for recycling. Issues such as timber, plastic, and metal, and there were skips for these items but not placed in the skip. I'm coming to the end, just nearly finished. So just to give you, again, the focus of the work was the average cost of waste in an 8-yard skip. So first of all, we've worked out a figure per cubic metre. So per cubic metre of waste, it was in the region of £375. The overall purchase cost of materials in the skip worked out over the 3 sites to be about 830, which is down on the previous figure from 2007. That might indicate either drop in purchase prices or possibly improvements in efficiencies. The average labour cost was virtually the same, showing not much change in labour costs. And this was new, this was not included in the 2007 figure, but a separate cost figure for fixing errors or replacing wrongly specified materials. That's where that comes from. On average, across the 3 sites, we worked it out to be 281. And then the actual hire cost of the skip on average has gone up from 160 to 195, and the VAT working out at 269. So here is what we might call the new figure of the average cost of an 8-yard skip, which is, albeit based on Scottish sites, we could apply it to the rest of UK, I'm sure, at 1618.99, but let's round it up and call it 1619. So you've heard it here first. That's the up-to-date figure based on 3 times the number of sites of the true cost of waste in your skip. Looking ahead then, Zero Waste Scotland were due to fund us to do a larger scale site in Scotland, more sites with more data. That's been put on hold for obvious reasons. But I'm willing to, if any partners, if you are interested in the work that I've done here, that I've presented today, we could look across the UK to apply it on other sites. You might find it useful. We could also create something in terms of digitizing the process with an app, which I've done a few things, as I've said in previous, with my IOSH research. In terms of using this method, it could be used at the beginning of a long-term program of work. It could be used for diagnostic purposes on problem sites, or it could be used for benchmarking purposes for process improvement. So just to see if you were listening, another quick quiz. What was that figure again? What was the new figure for the true cost of waste? So there's the options going from 1300 to 1619. I'll give you a minute just to get that in. And we're waiting. I'll give you it verbally because we do want to finish by about 2:15. If you remember correctly, it was 1619. So it was option number 5, and I'm sure we'll see a confirmation of that in just a moment. There we go. 74% of you are listening. The rest need to catch up. So I think I was asked to give a little top tips. I'm clicking my next slide, but it's not working. So I'm just checking if we need to, there we go. So a little bit of top tips. I would recommend that you do, in fact, try and find the source of your waste as opposed to merely bashing your subcontractors into submission. The use of digital tools can help, such as the laser scanning and BIM. Don't let welfare waste run out of control. Monitor and innovate where necessary. On larger sites, it did seem that having someone checking on what's in the skip, it doesn't need to be a supervisor, it can be a general operative, does pay off. And the usual stuff, good site practices, particularly in procurement and logistics on site, does help as well. So this is, I think, the one final question, and it's really just for me to feel out, to get a bit of feedback if you've enjoyed what you've seen here. You can choose, I don't know if you can choose more than one, but if you can only choose one, which one would it be? Would you like to collaborate on something in the future on that path, or would you merely like some information on that spreadsheet, or would you be interested in just some more information from the report? I can ask Zero Waste Scotland their permission to share the report with you, and if that's the case, I will forward you if you do indeed ask for it. There's a full report on this, including the 3 sites. So that concludes my talk today, ladies and gentlemen. So the final question is really, are there any questions from you now? So I've been viewing the PowerPoint slides, so I'm not privy to the Q&A that's been coming through. For your information, we did some calibration of the testing on the GCU campus, and that's what you're looking at in that photo. And I think it makes a great end to the slideshow in terms of what you can find in the average mixed waste skip.
Thank you very much, Billy. There's a few questions coming in, so I will go through them bit by bit. Interesting, sure. I picked up a couple of little things. One very little small thing that those in the UK of a certain age might remember, a broom handle in there. I must admit, I think Trigger from Only Fools and Horses would put his hair out for that, wouldn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
On the more sensible side, the in terms of, you mentioned recycle or reuse rather than sort of throw away. And things like, you know, drums, cable drums, you know, they're actually mixed material anyway. They generally have, am I right in saying, metal, there's plastic as well as wood. And for any, you know, to strip them down to recycling their constituent parts, it's again a cost element. So this reuse, how can we be smarter? How can we produce something that is more practical in that respect?
Yeah, I think from a site management perspective, and speaking as someone who did work on site, sometimes there's a balance between having to get the work done in a timely fashion and what you do with this waste, and you can't have it hanging around. Particularly that particular example was the busy city centre site where time is of premium as well as space. So you're faced with an option. And of course, there's intermediaries who can deal with that and take it from the city centre and deal with it in another location. But I'm trying, the thrust of what I'm trying to get across is, if you look at the source, why it's in there, and you know, there needs to be maybe another few layers of my questioning, a bit like accident investigation, 3 or 4 or 5 times the question, why is it there? Why did it need to get in the skip? Why is it not being picked up by the supplier and reused? That I'm sure that's really where you get to eventually answering some of the questions that will reduce the waste.
And it's interesting, especially with the last one. We know that the building industry is one where people have multiple employers and people do work for themselves. It was one said that if you work for a council housing department, a lot of that cost went towards someone's private house. Did you find any instances about people bringing their own waste from home or their own non-authorised waste that didn't come from construction activities on that site? Was there any evidence of that being abused by the workforce?
Well, on site 1, it was the skip was filled so quickly there was no scope for it. On site 3, house builders, there was, yes, some of the one-off items. There was a shower screen and an electric shower unit, which I assume was installed originally by the house builder, and the person who bought that particular plot possibly didn't like the specification and threw that in the skip. That's typical of house building. On the second site, which was more civil engineering, that was a very controlled and fenced off area, so not so much people bringing in from home, I suspect, but certainly from the welfare unit.
Moving on a bit, you mentioned 3D laser scanning. Someone's asked the question, was it calculated, and what is the actual saving possible? So does the offset of the costs give a saving?
Yeah. I mean, one of these, no one used that on any of the sites we were involved in. I was just putting that forward as a potential innovation that has been proved in the past to help reduce waste, because what it does, it gives you a more accurate measurement of an existing structure or building if you're going to refurbish or upgrade, and therefore it allows you to prefabricate. For example, when you're working on site, if you've got an element of prefabrication, the worry is always differential in the tolerance levels. So if you've got really accurate measurement, then you can use that. In terms of the costs, they are expensive for one-off projects. I can't give you the exact costs, but I do know that if you take a long-term policy decision and you start using this technology across multiple projects, multiple sites, then obviously you spread the cost, and you can offset therefore through the prefabrication and potentially the material costs for cutting waste.
Okay, some of the questions coming in there. A broad question from someone called Claire. I won't give surnames, guys. I'd be interested if Billy's done any work on design for health, as this is something we're really interested in. We've trained our designers on design for safety and sustainability, but are looking for help on design for health. That sounds like collaboration between you and I, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's been research and there's been collaboration and materials, guidance materials produced on design for health. I know a colleague of mine, Alistair Gibb from Loughborough University, a few years ago created a great resource, a design for health resource. I mean, it depends what you're meaning by health, because, you know, for designers and architects, health also means the health of the inhabitants of the building. So aspects of BREEAM include for the health of the occupants of the building as well. So I think there's a lot of materials and resources already there for design for health, to be honest.
Brilliant. Okay. Next question, and they're coming in. So I'd ask at the moment if no more questions come in, because I think we'll struggle to get through what we have. Karen asked a question about your cost earlier on there regarding labour costs. Should that be distances divided by average speed, not multiplied? I'm guessing. Yes.
It was, I think, yeah, it was all in a spreadsheet, and I'm sure it was double checked by someone with better math skills than me. But it was, what we did was actually each individual item, the reality was the spreadsheet has a line, has a row for each item that's been put in the skip, which identifies where it has came from. So if from the location where it's came from gives us the distance that the operative has travelled, and then the distance that they have travelled allows us to calculate with the hourly rates as a time cost, was it time, distance, velocity calculation, whatever that is. That was used to work out what the what the labour cost was based on how long it took them to take every individual item of waste to the skip, and then it was cumulatively calculated up. So that's why it looks quite small. The figures involved are quite, in terms of labour costs, are quite small, because it's purely the collection and the travel distance multiplied by the hourly rate.
Okay. Stephen's asked a question. What is learning waste? Can you give examples?
Yeah, so if there was some new product on the market, and if the workers were using it for the first time, they might, for example, make a mistake with a fixing and damage the product itself, or the product goes, if it has to cure, it might go off prematurely because they've not quite worked out. It might be a new fantastic fast curing concrete, and it's gone off too quickly. Things like that, because they've not learned how best to work with it. So very niche, a very niche example, and I don't think any of it was used in terms of our identification of the source of the waste.
Next question has come in from, there's two on regulation. Karen, I'm interested to note the amount of plasterboard in the skip, much over the below 10% permissible under the old plasterboard regs allowance.
So I take it that was for site number 1, quite a substantial amount of plasterboard. So there was no full boards, it was all offcuts from plasterboard. So it indicates that there's potentially a high amount of wastage through unusual dimensions. Remember, it's a refurbishment, so it's not a new build, so there'll be lots of unusual dimensions, I would imagine, on the site to contend with. I'm not sure, what was it? Was a specific question I was asked there to answer in terms of, does it contravene regulations? Was that?
Yes, it's regarding the previous regulations on plasterboard in skips, I believe, which I must admit I'm not an expert in.
I would say it's not something I'm an expert in either, but as I said earlier, I'm not sure what happened to that mixed waste skip after it left the site, and it could be, it's quite typical, I think, that in many cases the waste contractor would take that to their depot and manually segregate it at the depot, and then you would get feedback at a later date from your supplier if that gyprock or plasterboard has been recycled, has been sent into the recycling. So I can't comment on what happened to it after it left. So it could be that it's been dealt with in a more sustainable manner. But what I'm concerned with, of course, is the source of why it's there to try and reduce its production in the first place.
One of our colleagues, Alistair, who known to us both well, has what rightly said, and I appreciate this, can we raise the issue that plasterboard is banned from landfill and source segregation is essential? It's a message the waste industry is struggling to get out. So that is now out there today and on the webinar. Excellent. And on YouTube. So YouTube Excellent. Getting your health and safety message.
Thanks for that, Alistair.
And then site waste management plan regulations. My experience was under the old regulations, clients, designers would not engage at project design planning stage. So it's always left to the contractor, meaning it was just a record of waste rather than how effective the planning was. So the regs were not working effectively anyway. Did the removal of these mandatory regulations make a difference to construction waste? So maybe a bigger question than just your study.
Yeah, I was very frustrated. I mean, they were a very short-lived set of regulations. When I saw them at first, knowing what I knew at the time about why waste arises on construction sites, I thought the regulations themselves were pretty much aimed at the if you apply the IOSH thinking to it, I thought the regulations were applied very much at the PPE side of the hierarchy, and I didn't rate them to start with. I didn't think they were fit for purpose, to be honest, and they had a very short life and they were binned, so excuse the pun, after a very short period of time they no longer exist. So I think my answer to that is I didn't like the way site waste management plan regulations to start with. I thought they could have been a bit more upstream in their emphasis, and I think they actually directed project teams towards the contractor and towards the end of the process rather than towards the beginning of the process. So it's no wonder that designers and clients did not engage, but it could be the same said of the CDM regulations as well, trying to get clients and designers to engage there. So it might be that it's if they don't see the interest, if they don't see the benefit of it to them, then how do you get them to engage in the process?
Interesting. Barry's made a comment. In commercial construction, waste is staged on floors until the material hoist is up and running. It'll be interesting to understand the impact cost of that on work, shifting piles because they're in the way, etc. I mean, it's a comment, and I would come into there are safety implications as well, because a clean and tidy workplace is a safe workplace, isn't it? The basic principles.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few aspects to that. There's the time and cost implications of having to handball waste and continuously move it around if it's in the way, and it becomes a trip hazard, so it's got a safety issue. But then there's the time is money, so the waste needs to get to the skip as soon as possible, as soon as it arises. So there's lots of issues there to contend with, which is again, I suppose, points to the issue of if you can prevent it in the first place, then that's always the best option, of course, according to the hierarchy.
So hopefully a yes/no one, because time's going on. I'm going to try and do some yes/no quick ones here. Linda has asked a question: fixing quality. Was this due to poor quality workmanship or because the wrong size type of material is being used?
It could be one or the other, and that's an area where I'd given you a health warning in that to try and manage your expectations, saying we've only really managed to scrape the surface. The infrastructure within the spreadsheet is there to ask those questions further back. That's the next level back, the second why, which we, at the time that we had for our researcher on site, we didn't get, but it could yes, be either of those two, and it requires more time and effort to ask that. So hopefully if we get a chance to replicate the pilot on larger scale sites with the contractors who are willing to engage with us, then hopefully we can get to one or two layers back in the causation chain. Next one is interesting. The answer might be a familiar word from another
which is typical for many sectors. From Patrick, many of the site waste comes from over-ordering due to inexperience over budget of material quantity. Is there better ways this could be managed? I think the question is, the answer is probably yes, but the key thing is how. But that's a far bigger one. Do you want any quick one-liners?
Yeah. I can never give you a yes, no, or a quick answer, as you know, David. I've experienced that myself. You even go to the people who should know. The house I live in just now is a new build house, and at the back I had a small dwarf wall built, and I knew from my own experience how much I needed for the foundation, the strip foundation. But I asked the bricklayer who I employed for an estimate of how much mortar I would need between the bricks, and the estimate he gave me was maybe at least twice as much as we needed. So there you go. What's that? Is that inexperience? Is that a lack of information and knowledge that people can draw on? Because that kind of knowledge is the kind of stuff that you keep to yourself because it's got commercial value. So it's quite difficult to share, to get people to share such knowledge. It's a difference between one contractor and the other contractor in terms of their knowledge, their skill, and their capability.
But that goes back to a bigger question that I think is, this is my naivety maybe, is when a contractor over budgets and overprices for something, the client pays it. Materials not required. Who's quids in with that? Does that give them back to the client, or does the contractor make that saving from them? How is it? What's is there opportunity for research in that area?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, from my experience when I worked on site, that was definitely the contractor's domain, and the client, as far as the contractor would be concerned in that scenario, the contractor has no business knowing the waste. I dare say different contractual arrangements in more recent times, such as partnering and alliancing and open book, make that assumption probably obsolete now and redundant. So I'd probably need to update my knowledge on more current approaches to accounting on construction sites to ascertain if there would be more of an input from the client side with a more open book approach.
Wade has asked a question and made a comment: waste compliance. On many occasions, I've followed the skip waste lorry to the weigh-in and disposal area to check documentation disposal. This has been best practice for many years in the industry I work in. Are you saying this is not the case in Scotland, where trials were redone to the contractors? So it's really how often, I think, are these waste lorries, monitored by the client?
I don't know. I mean, the bee in my bonnet that I had with the waste contractor was that it seemed obvious to me that a quicker way to collect the data was not as it's going into the skip on the site, which takes a long time, but once you've got a full skip and it goes to either the depot or the waste transfer station, could you take a moment? I was asking the waste contractor, could they take a moment to tip all the waste from one mixed skip out to use the spreadsheet to identify the type, the volume. What you won't get from that is the source of the waste. Of course, you need that from the site as well. But what I experienced was a lack of cooperation and that was at least 3 waste contractors. So it was more around cooperation and the waste contractor not willing to break their productivity sequence to engage with the research project. So not so much in terms of how they interact with their supply chain to confirm the validity of where the waste was going.
Okay, it's 5 past. We'll go on till about 1/4 past, and I'll have to call it a day because I know you've got to go elsewhere, and we've got more questions to answer than we've actually had answered. What we'll do is we'll ask our colleagues in support at IOSH to print off and save the chat and the Q&A, and we can maybe do something offline and then add it to the IOSH website adjacent to this. So we'll go and run on to another 10 minutes and more. I think we'll have to call it a day in fairness to everybody. Next question, very much from Victoria. I would like to know if there's any pilot running on reducing packaging waste in construction. That would be very instructive to see any initiatives. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, I mean, something I've not touched on today is the issue of packaging waste. I think in general, compared to say a decade or 2 ago, you are seeing pockets of good practice in terms of reducing materials that have been purchased that ends up in the skip. The one area where there's stubborn difficulty is around packaging, and I think packaging as a result is taking up a bigger proportion of typical skips as a result of that. So it's an area that I could really focus on in its own right, as ways of, I know there's equipment, there's innovative equipment on the market that deals specifically with recycling packaging. But again, that's at the wrong end of the market for me. That's at the wrong end of the waste hierarchy. We should be thinking more around packaging that do we need the packaging? If we do need it, is it a type of packaging that could be designed carefully so that it can be reused, or even packaging that's biodegradable if it can't be reused? These are the kind of things where I'd like to do a bit of research myself.
Okay, another comment has come in that I think it could be a tip-top tip almost from Patrick, who basically says this presentation will enhance how I audit ISO 14001 on site visits. And I think that's a good key learning point, actually, supply chain, if the client drives down through their compliance. So that's a very important comment. Someone else, Helen, has made a comment. I had no idea how much this could be. How can the message be put across to the workers? It's a big culture issue. Communication with workers, that's another question, isn't it? That's another presentation there, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, particularly with the welfare waste. I'd picked up on that issue of, because behaviour change programmes don't just apply to safety, of course. Behavioural science could be applied in a number of areas, and waste is one of them, particularly that welfare waste, and incentive schemes. Say what you will about incentive schemes. I'm a fan of them because there's various things here at play. In construction, we already offer incentive schemes. We offer, in one way or another, incentive schemes for productivity, whether it be paying someone by a measure or paying them a lump sum, which entices them to complete the work quicker. There are incentive schemes for productivity in various formats. So what that tells workers is, if there's money involved for productivity, that's the important thing, right? So regardless of what the theory says around don't offer incentive schemes, because the theory dictates that's an external motivator, and if you lose the money, then you lose the behaviour. That's all well and good, but you're telling your workers that productivity is important when you pay them a bonus or some form of incentive for productivity. Therefore, that's what's foremost in their mind. If you introduce some sort of incentive scheme for something that's important to the business in terms of reduction of waste, then you're using the same mechanisms to achieve the goal that the organisation wants to achieve.
There's a lot of research about incentives, I think, across the piece worth looking at. I mean, again, that's not a topic in its own right, but I know in the public sector within the area where I live that 1% of your, so a 2% pay rise in the council, 1% pay rise is down to individual performance related. And part of that incentive is you overwork people, so potentially they work half an hour extra a day to achieve their target. So in effect, they're getting people to work potentially 5 or 6% longer for the chance they might get a 1% pay rise. That to me is a disincentive, not incentive when you start breaking it all down. Yeah.
I think a more relatable incentive scheme is the types that you now see from local authorities for households. Incentive schemes to recycle better and to segregate better, and you might get brownie points or club points for certain products that you can buy. I think that's a good template for particularly the construction worker welfare facility scenario that we saw on site 2 of the work that I presented.
On incentives, Martin's asked a question saying, do you think there would be as much waste if a contractor was carrying out work on his or her own property?
Yeah, so again, there's lots written about how motivation changes if it's internal or external, and if internally motivated in terms of your own property or your own project, then it does change, of course. Yeah, I would agree.
Stephen made a comment. The supervisor moving the recyclables was not wearing gloves to protect their hands.
Well done for spotting that. You wouldn't be doing your job otherwise. Yes, caught out trying to do a good thing.
that happens. People do try and do the right things, and they cut corners from perspectives. They end up in creating more problems by thinking they're being helpful.
Yeah.
So, and Patrick says, asked the question, was special waste taken into consideration in the stats? As I always have, this is my waste management plan for the construction site. This can prove to be very expensive.
In terms of special waste, on site one, not covered in my presentation, not covered in the photos, there was some items of hazardous waste. Now, I don't know if there was, because they knew they were being observed by us, but the site management team removed a couple of items, solvent, paints and such like, from the waste skip at the time, and was dealt with in an appropriate manner. So it was interesting, I did think at that time, does that always happen? Or is that just because we are on site watching things going on? So yeah, it's an area that, again, the industry struggles to grapple with at site level in some respects, I would say.
Do you know of any international studies done in the same subject, or is this in recent ones?
Internationally, you know a bit more about this than me, actually, David. Internationally, mainland Europe, there's a few studies. I've personally seen studies done in China also. Do you want to chip in with anything on that yourself, David?
I've not, in terms of this particular topic, in terms of costing skips, I've not actually had time to look into that. So that's hasn't been on my radar. But again, like anything, it's ongoing research. It's a pilot. It's limited by its three sites you've picked up on, and like a lot of these things, I think there's a phrase we use, seedling from, when you start a piece of work. I think more data is needed, isn't it, to really start to get the idea of savings, and also consider, as you said, things like laser monitoring as well for bigger sites. How can that work? So, like anything, we're just touching the water, our toes in the water on this, isn't it, to a great extent?
Yeah.
I think
and in some respects, the whole cost, putting the actual figure, a realistic figure that's believable as well, is important. But putting that figure to the materials in the skip plays a part in that, motivating and convincing people they should do otherwise. And I feel as if I'm bashing the house builder, but in particular the house builder, extremely wasteful in terms of what was going in the skip. And makes me speculate, is it because their profit margins are so lucrative that they feel they don't, maybe I'm tarring all house builders with the same brush. That's inappropriate. So I don't know, it's something that I'd like to look at to see if that's the issue.
We've got literally 2 minutes. I'll take another 2 questions. Susanna, ideas for training staff on waste priorities, including good health and safety as well as environmental concerns. So again, this is a comment really about induction and things such as that, and actually engaging with the workforce better.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of worker engagement in terms of health and safety. I've not looked to that area in terms of other aspects of worker involvement on site, but it does help. I mean, if you're engaged in the process, some people do not want to be engaged, of course, but if you're motivated and you have the capability, then it should be offered. And the research shows that the organisation reaps benefits as a result.
Is there any data for waste sent for incineration? If so, what data is there on energy generated?
Was that energy from waste? Was that, David?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was in discussions I had early on with Zero Waste Scotland. We were churning around all the different aspects of this sort of project and what could we conceivably include in the data analysis, and the energy from waste. I think the best we could come up with is, if we got the type of waste, the volume of waste, then we would just use Zero Waste Scotland themselves. I agreed with them that they could then just use some algorithm that would then take the type and the quantity and generate what the energy value was, and indeed other things like the CO2 values as well. So that's over to them. I don't know to what extent they've done that yet, or if they've done it at all.
Okay. The last question then we'll take. There's still 30 odd that we'll deal with afterwards. So I do apologise for not taking it. And it's a name I'm familiar, so John. Is there any duty on suppliers to take back packaging of materials?
I'm sure. I think that it's not. There's packaging regulations, But in terms of taking those things back, I think it only depends on the type of industry and the type of packaging, I'm sure. But at this moment in time, I don't think there's any universal. I might be wrong in that assumption.
And I'll pick one more question then, last thing. Did the study go as far as benefits of waste management on the contractor's return on investment?
In terms of return on investment, no. Again, that was another issue that we discussed at early stage. Could we create or calculate a figure for that return on investment? It was decided that this was really the purpose of the project was getting the baseline, the new baseline for the figure. So the return on investment is something that I think could come later as part of another study, because it is important. Because again, people might not believe you. You might say, no, this new figure of 16,1619. I'll be keen to see someone use it in a presentation soon, so as I can satisfy my curiosity. But to what extent do contractors believe that figure? To what extent do they believe that they should invest time, money, and effort to achieve that? Could the time, money, and effort be more than £1,600 per skip? Therefore, it's not worth the return on investment. But that's looking at it purely from a financial perspective. There's other factors, of course, as well, which are environmental impact, reputational damage from having huge amounts of waste. So,
on that point, time is up. The webinar space we have is needed by other people as well. Billy, thank you very much indeed. Thank you again to my colleagues at IOSH for facilitating this. I hope to see many of you come back for our next session in 2 weeks' time, which I think you'll find, if you check the EWEMG website, there'll be real tips from how learning from one industry can be used for supervising and managing and leading on health and safety in another. So I'll let you check the EWNG website for that. So thank you very much indeed, and cheerio. Bye all.
Thanks, David. Bye-bye.